Welcome to Design for Learning, a podcast from Notre Dame Learning. I'm your host, Jim Lang. Today we discuss the question of how higher education should evolve in our post-pandemic artificial intelligence era. In the book, co-edited by today's guests, the editors chart a historical arc spurred by the pandemic. The pandemic disrupted everything. We responded with new ideas and strategies to teach students. As the pandemic receded, it seemed like higher education was going to move in some interesting new directions. But the pull back to more traditional forms of education was strong, and change has not happened as quickly as we might have imagined. So what happened? And should we consider what happened a good or a bad thing? To help us think through that question, I am joined today by Maggie Debelius, who is the Senior Director of Faculty Initiatives at the Center for New Designs in Learning and Scholarship at Georgetown University. She is also a teaching professor in the English department and a professor and director of graduate studies for the MA program in Learning, Design, and Technology. She's the author of So What Are You Going to Do with That? Finding Careers Outside of Academia, which is published in 2014 by the University of Chicago Press, as well as numerous articles on writing pedagogy and faculty development. She holds a PhD in English from Princeton University and an MA from Georgetown. So Maggie, welcome especially to a fellow English PhD.
Thanks, Jim. Glad to be here.
Okay, so you're one of the co-editors of a new book titled Recentering Learning, Complexity, Resilience, and Adaptability in Higher Education, which was published in December by Johns Hopkins University Press. So let's start by having you share the basic premise of the book and how it came together with your two co-editors, Josh Kim and Eddie Maloney.
Great, thanks. Well, Jim, like so many colleagues at Centers for Teaching and Learning, Eddie, Josh, and I were just slammed at the beginning of the pandemic. We really had to kick into overdrive. And I had so many friends who were like learning to make sourdough bread or teaching themselves to knit or other things like that. But for me, it was one of the busiest times of my career. And so there wasn't really a lot of time for quiet contemplation about what we were doing. We were just trying to help faculty make this emergency switch to remote teaching and just working long hours to do it. But we did make a little bit of time to reach out to colleagues at other universities and to try to learn from their experience and just trade best practices, things that were working on different campuses. And so that was really the germ of the book. After the dust settled, we really thought, hey, we need to document some of this really intense work that happened certainly in the beginning of the pandemic. But even, well into the second or third year of the pandemic, we were still doing that work. And so what it boiled down to for us was that we really believe that a serious investment in teaching and learning is the only way for universities to build resilience and to prepare for future interruptions. And we knew there would be more interruptions. And so we were able to gather together this group of really brilliant people and try to learn from what they did during that switch to remote teaching and distill some lessons.
So how soon after the pandemic started, and you were after the remote sort of emergency, switch to remote teaching and learning, how early did you start making that call out to other colleagues to ask them, what are you doing? And how long was the process of actually putting the whole thing together?
So the calls to colleagues started, for me, almost immediately. We, like so many campuses, sent students home in March of 2020, and then, tried to get people up and running for the rest of that spring semester. So I started reaching out to, colleagues at Wake Forest, and, Josh is at Dartmouth. So people who I had worked with before to try to figure out what they were doing. So those sort of scattered calls happened in the spring and throughout the summer. We were running course design institutes, and many other universities were running sort of similar models. But the idea for the book really didn't come together until the fall semester at the very early stages. Like the spring and the summer was just too full of work to even think about publishing something.
It's amazing. Even in fall, you were able to think about a book possibly because you're right. That was a difficult time, and even into the fall and into the next year, it was hard to think about. I think actually for myself, I actually had a book come out in the fall in October of that year, and I could barely concentrate on that. And it took me several years actually to get into the mindset of developing a new idea for a project. So it's amazing you were able to do that, even starting in the fall. So I want to talk about something that you wrote in the introduction, which describes how something I mentioned in the introduction to the podcast, which is that, there was this big disruption and then we thought it was going to change everything. But then there was this push backwards toward more, when we sort of got back on campus and many people were just like, thank goodness, we're back on campus, we can go back to our traditional ways. So here's how you described it in the introduction. In the relief and joy of returning to in-person classes and residential life, it can be forgotten how much beauty was co-created by learners and educators in their shared efforts to build educational resilience. And so I kind of noticed two things in there. First of all, there is joy in kind of in-person, as residential experiences on a college, and even in forms of traditional education. But there's also then opportunities that come, and good things happen when in that moment of disruption. So can you talk a little bit about both those things?
Sure. Yeah. So there really is something magical about the residential college experience. It's not the only way to learn for sure, but there's definitely a power in it that many of us, I think, took for granted before we lost it. But then with the pivot to remote teaching, we learned something else. And that was that we could harness some of that magic even after we made the shift. And it looked different. One of my students actually wrote this beautiful graphic novel called Things Are Different Now about the switch to remote teaching. Her name is Claire Reed, and I highly recommend it. It's on the Candles website. But things are different now, but learning was still happening. And the pandemic shut down, our residence halls, our dining halls, it shut down labs, it shut down big sports, so much of what goes on in a university couldn't happen. But we kept teaching and students kept learning. And there was just something really beautiful in our ability to keep that central function alive. And that's really our central argument, that universities need to make those investments in teaching and learning in order to prepare for the next big interruption. And I hope it's not another pandemic, but it might be. It'll certainly be climate emergencies, as we saw in the LA fires recently. A lot of colleges in California had to close their campuses. Last fall, when the hurricanes hit the Southeast, social unrest like the Gaza protests, many universities had to move online, and we don't know what the impact of a new presidential administration is going to be on higher ed, but we know that there are going to be interruptions. So we just need to build that resilience and be prepared to adapt and to keep learning going.
Yeah, I love that idea that there's beauty in struggle. And I think also the fact that there's beauty in also people coming together, right, around a shared cause. And I think that's probably part of what helps get that sense of something good happened here. And the book really brings that out because you see everyone, there's probably, 20, 30 authors across all the essays, and they're all working together on this same idea of how do we now take that and push it forward to make positive change and also make sure that we're ready for the next time, right? As you point out, and that might be wildfires. It could be, stuff from the new administration. So all those things can be the next disruptions, right?
Absolutely. Yeah. For me, it was a different kind of edited collection. I've been part of other edited collections before, but this felt like more of a community collective effort because we got all the authors together over Zoom a couple of times and had a chance to
Everyone,
talk to
all of them.
I mean, not everybody could come to every Zoom meeting,
Yeah.
but other edited collections, I've done my piece and other people have done their piece, and that's been great, but there hasn't been much talk back between or among authors. So it was the widespread availability of Zoom. That was another thing that was made possible.
Absolutely, I'm going to recommend that to people who are interested in doing edited collections. That's a fantastic idea, just from a writing perspective or like a publishing perspective, so they can understand what everyone's doing and how there's a kind of shared commitment to the subject matter. That's wonderful. Um, so actually now I want to ask a question about the actual contributors themselves, because you make a point about this actually in the book's introduction that most of your contributors are actually were not in traditional tenure track faculty positions. A few had professor in their titles, but most of them did not. So you mentioned this in the book's introduction. So why was it important to mention that?
Well, I have learned over the course of my long career that teaching really isn't something that just happens between a professor and her students. Like there used to be that kind of old hub and spoke model where the professor was the hub and all the students were the spokes. But it doesn't happen like that anymore, or it shouldn't. Instead, we have a network of people who make learning and innovation happen at our universities. So we have staff from libraries, teaching centers, digital learning professionals, writing centers. I started my own career in writing centers, academic resource centers, career centers, counseling centers. All of these folks came together during the pandemic to support our students and to make teaching and learning continue. And that network is how we got through. And I learned so much from my colleagues across the university in different offices. So it wouldn't make any sense to write a book without them. I mean, we were all in this together, so we had to be together in the book.
Yeah, that's great. And actually, I want to highlight the fact that there are a couple of student voices in the collection. And in one particular, there was, I think, in one essay, it features three students. One was an undergraduate, and I think a couple were graduate students. Is that what it was? Yeah.
Yeah.
And so those are really enlightening to read, especially for me, the undergraduate one, because that student started in the fall of the pandemic, and I had a daughter who had the same situation. And it was a really, really terrible experience for her in some ways because, all the little things that were happening around, like even getting food and not being able to make friends in the same way, all that stuff was really, really difficult. And you hear that in her essay. She's sort of lamenting that fact that she didn't have those experiences. But so I'm curious to know, for you as an editor or a reader, when you read those essays, what do you think we should learn from them? What did you learn from them? What should the readers learn from hearing the student voices from the collection?
So I will say, Jim, that I am also the parent of a kid who had his freshman year interrupted by the pandemic. So this is personal as well as professional for me. But it was essential to us that we have student voices in the collection. So we have undergraduate and graduate voices in the essay that you mentioned. There are a few other chapters that are written with graduate students. So, they are part of that network of learning and collective learning that happened during the pandemic. And if anything, I feel even more committed to students as partners work. I've published with my students in the past, but now it feels even more urgent. So certainly the pandemic experience, we needed to know what students were going through in order to be able to teach them. Before we could sort of assume. I have taught 18 to 21-year-olds at Georgetown for 23 years now. And, they change a little bit over the years, but I basically know what their dorms look like, or, that they have food from the cafeteria, or that, many of them have internships on the Hill, or I know the drill, but everything was different. And I didn't know what they were going through.
Great point.
There were students who had, parents lost jobs, people died, there were awful things happening. But then there were students who weren't going through those experiences, and we needed to hear from them. And I think that it's only going to become more urgent with something like AI. I have to talk to my students about it. They are introducing me to uses of AI that I don't know about. So it's always been important to hear from our students and to have them be part of that network of learning. But as time goes by, it feels even more urgent.
Yeah, it's a really good point. The fact that what they were going through was so unusual. Like our expectations or previous experiences just didn't pan out. And I think about the fact that I had two children had gone to college before that daughter, and the advice I used to give to them about, like, for example, finding friends and socializing, it just didn't work. I say, like, you have to have meals with people. She was like, we are not allowed to do that, right? So we had to hear their voices to understand truly what they were going through.
Absolutely. Yeah, in the case of my own son, when he was a freshman, he pledged a fraternity, and I had some hesitation about that. I know that sometimes there can be some pretty risky behavior in Greek life, but it turned out to be the thing that kept him anchored to his campus and made him want to go back when it was safe to return. So even though I've spent my career in higher ed, I feel like mom's advice was actually pretty outdated. That
Yeah,
he the right decision for him, and it turned out to be a good thing.
yeah. So I'm going to push very gently back at one thing you say in the
Sure.
introduction,
Mhm.
and very gently because I'm a nice guy, but also because I'm not sure about it, actually. You say something in introduction about we learned during the pandemic that actually this myth that we have about higher education moves slowly, you can't adapt. We saw that happen actually, so we don't have to believe that anymore. But I'm kind of wondering though if we came back so quickly in more traditional forms, does that actually contradict with that idea? So like, can we adapt? I mean, you can think about in that relationship now to artificial intelligence too. Like, how well are we adapting? I don't know. What's your take on it?
Yeah, I mean, you raise a good point. We have returned to a lot of the way things were, and that's becoming even more true in hindsight. But there are also a lot of things that have changed pretty significantly that I think we can hang on to. So, I've certainly had students over the past few semesters who, for very good reasons, have not been able to be physically present in class, whether it was, illness or, I had a student whose grandmother was dying and wanted to go home and spend a little time with her before she had to say goodbye. And so she was able to Zoom into class, and not every professor allows that. It's at the discretion of the individual faculty member at Georgetown, but that's not anything we could have ever done before. Our classrooms weren't set up like that, and I wasn't tech savvy enough to make it work. Um, and my relationships that I've built with colleagues across the university, different staff members in different offices, those are so much stronger. And so, now if I have a student in distress, I know exactly who to call and I know what resources are available in a way that I didn't before. So, in some ways, you know, the change has not stuck, but in other ways, I really, I see faculty who I think are doing some a different kind of relationship building with their students than they did before the pandemic. Something like sending out a pre-course survey. That was a pretty, it happened before the pandemic, but it was not widespread at Georgetown. But now most faculty members I work with send out a pre-course survey, try to get to know their students before they meet them in the physical classroom. So I think that, some changes have taken hold.
No, you're right. Actually, as you're saying these things, I'm kind of realizing even for myself, I'm much more aware now of what might be going on in my students' lives, which that might have impacted their ability to come to class or to get something in on time. And no question about it, that has been a big attitude shift among faculty. You actually see it in the literature as well, in books like Kate Denial's Pedagogy of Kindness. And so these kinds of books are really focused on this notion that we did learn a lot about our students, that stuff we didn't even know before. It was out there. We weren't interested in it. We didn't ask about it. And I think most people, you're right, now are kind of much more aware of this. They find ways to help students engage with the materials or with the class that they maybe wouldn't have done before. They would have just said, that student is just not a good student, or they're not coming to class, and I'm going to just not worry about that. That's not my problem. I think we're much more aware now. We can help with these problems, right? I think that is, you're right. That's a big change, I think, across much of higher education. So let's talk a little bit about, I raised the specter of artificial intelligence a few minutes ago. So let's talk about that a little bit. So I know how books work, and they take a long time to produce, and the production and all that, the timelines are long. So, and we talked about the fact that the initial, the reason for having the book come to existence was the pandemic. At the same time, in the introduction, you do mention that artificial intelligence has arrived. So clearly you're writing that after, that had happened. And so the book's essays, though, probably they're not really focused so much on that. But I'm curious now to see how you see recentering learning happening now. Like, How do we have to recenter learning now in 2025 and beyond?
Excellent question. I really think that the widespread availability of generative AI actually makes the central premise of the book even more urgent. That we need even more to double down on evidence-based teaching. And for me, AI at its best gives me the opportunity to talk more openly with learning about learning with my students, to really be much more mindful of the fact that this is why we're doing this assignment. This is what I hope you get out of it. Because if I don't do that, then of course they'll be tempted to just use Chat GPT. But to be able to have an honest conversation about, the goals and what we know about learning. I was having a conversation yesterday with my students about metacognition, and how the research shows that metacognition just, increases learning in so many ways. And it can only, you only need to take a couple of minutes, but it really pays off. And we talked about how if students want to use ChatGPT to write their reflections on their paper, then they can do that, but I think it's a huge waste. You're denying yourself the opportunity to think about who you are and what matters to you, and just outsourcing it to AI completely defeats the purpose of the assignment. But I know that the emergence of AI has really refocused some instructor energy on trying to detect inappropriate use, and to, worries about cheating. And that's a reality, especially for people who are teaching large classes. I don't want to dismiss that, but what I'm really hoping is that we can actually just engage in some ongoing conversations with our students about how learning works, and how they can develop some of those important critical thinking and digital literacy skills that they are going to need in an AI world. So I'm hoping that it really strengthens those student faculty partnerships instead of erode them.
I mean, to a certain extent, we could sort of, the model that you described being created in the pandemic, which is people coming together from across the campus actually to address the pandemic. That could be a model for what we do with AI as well, right? Maybe I think faculty members are sort of me against the AI and the student, right? In terms of like, are they doing the actual work that I've assigned to them? And maybe we need to open up that conversation as well to learning theorists and psychologists and people who help us understand what kind of impact this is going to have on people's learning or performance outcomes, all that kind of stuff, as well as other people on campus, academic integrity, offices, as well as even like residential folks. I mean, all those folks can have a role to play in helping people understand what role this thing has in our futures going forward.
I agree. Absolutely.
So, I'm the small teaching guy, so I have to like ask for some things that I sort of take away stuff here to think a little bit about the potential audiences for your book. And so I want to think about how we always start, right? How do we start recentering learning on a campus? And I invite you to think about this in both terms of like a campus, but also like an individual and instructor. Mm-hmm. Right? I know that the book's audiences are multiple, and you want to reach the book to reach people are administrators and staff and faculty. And so let's think a little bit about how do we start recentering learning first, maybe at institutional level, but also at the faculty member. What can they do initially to just start this process?
Absolutely. So I'm going to start micro, and then we can get a little bit more.
Yeah, okay. You can, absolutely.
So at the level of an individual faculty member, reach out to your Center for Teaching and Learning. If you're not already a customer, these people are here to help you. My colleagues in teaching centers around the country are wonderful people. I know them. I can tell you that they really want to help, and they have some ideas that can actually make your life easier, your teaching a much more pleasurable experience. And as you know, the small teaching guide, like, they don't have to be hard. There are some small tweaks that you can make that will make your lives better, your students' lives better. Invest in your teaching now before disaster strikes. And it'll make your life better in the short term because teaching will just be more fun. But in the long term, when another interruption happens, you will have built that relationship, and you will have some of those skills at your disposal. So that's my number one piece
I
of
agree. It's a good idea.
advice. Yeah, that's
Yeah.
something we can all enact. Um, and then at the kind of institutional level, I will say the more that institutions can do to sort of build networks before disaster strikes. Like we're really siloed as institutions, and the pandemic forced us to kind of break down a few of those silos, but I already see it sliding back the other way. We are all super busy in our individual offices, but if there are ways that we can, my dream is like to have a secondment program where I could trade some teaching and learning staff with, like send some of the teaching and learning people over to the library for 2 months, or send some of the library people over to the career center, or, we all have expertise, and I don't want to pretend like anybody can do any job, but getting to know what other people do can really, I think, pay off in the long run. And again, help us prepare to be adaptable and resilient. Um, and then my last piece of advice, this is something that does not need a big institutional initiative. Again, this can be done at the level of individuals, but prioritize relationships, our relationships with our students that really took a different form during the pandemic. We need those more than ever. And as you mentioned, there's been some great research in this, certainly Kate Denial's book, but I'm also thinking of like Peter Felton and Leo Lambert's Relationship Rich Education, or Dan Porterfield's new book. We know how much this matters. And so being able to build relationships with our students and with our colleagues across the university, that is what is going to be our best hope for facing inevitable changes.
So I love that idea of, having these sort of, people coming from different offices and coming in for a couple of months or two. I love that idea. Actually, it should across institutions as well, right? You can spend a month at another teaching center and you send someone over to that. That's a great idea. You should write that up.
I'm on it.
You write it up and I'll bring you back onto the podcast. How about that?
That sounds great. We talk a lot about preparing our students for uncertainty, and they're going to be working in jobs that haven't been invented yet. And so we need to prepare them for the unknown. I think that we need to do the same thing with our institutions. Like we don't know what's coming. So we need to invest in strategies that will help us prepare for a really uncertain future.
Thanks very much, Maggie. It's been great to talk to you, and thanks for the great book you all put together.
Thank you.
Designed for Learning is a production of Notre Dame Learning at the University of Notre Dame. For more, visit our website at learning.nd.edu.